Clara sat cross-legged on her bed, pencil moving quickly across the sketchpad in front of her. Her room, a mixture of soft sunlight and scattered art supplies, was her sanctuary. Since her mother had passed away 2 years ago, these quiet moments had become more than a hobby. They were a way to hold herself together. She drew faces, landscapes, and bits of imagination, letting the lines of her pencil reflect emotion she didn't always express in words. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the radiator and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. She was so absorbed in her sketching that the soft knock on her door startled her. At first, she froze, pencil midair. It was unusual for anyone to enter her room unannounced. "Clara, can I come in?" The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar in its tone. Clara recognized it immediately. Her stepfather, Richard. Her heart skipped a beat. Richard rarely entered her room. Their relationship had always been polite, distant even, but never invasive. She had expected a visit from him to be about chores, a reminder for dinner, or some casual question about school. This, however, felt different. There was a vulnerability in the way he spoke, an uncertainty that made her pause. "Sure," she said finally, trying to steady her voice. Richard opened the door slowly and stepped inside. For a moment, he just stood there, looking around at her room, the sketches pinned to the walls, the stack of notebooks on the desk, the small trinkets her mother had left behind. Clara noticed for the first time how tired he looked, how the lines around his eyes seemed deeper, like he was carrying more than he let anyone see. His suit jacket was slightly wrinkled, evidence of a long day at work, but he seemed almost fragile in that moment. I didn't want to bother you," he began, his voice low, "but I thought maybe you'd like to talk. I haven't really connected with you in a while." Clara blinked. Talk? Connect? She didn't know what to say. She had spent years avoiding deep conversations with Richard, partly out of habit, partly because grief had left her cautious. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. Richard glanced around again, stopping at a sketch she had started but not finished, a portrait of a woman staring at a window. Its features tentative but full of emotion. "Your sketches. They're really beautiful," he said quietly. Clara felt her cheeks warm. Compliments from Richard were rare, almost non-existent. She wasn't sure whether to be flattered or wary. She gave a small nod, unsure of what else to say. He took a step closer, but didn't touch anything. His eyes stayed on the artwork. I know I've been distant," he said after a pause. "I guess I didn't realize how much I've missed. Just being around you. You're important, Clara, more than I probably ever said." The words hit her like a sudden wind. It wasn't romantic, not in any sense, but it was personal and raw. She felt something stir in her chest, surprise, confusion, and a strange comfort. Richard had always been a background figure in her life, reliable yet distant. Now, for the first time, she saw him as someone who wanted to reach out, who genuinely cared. Clara swallowed hard. I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm not always good at expressing these things. But I wanted you to know. You matter." She wanted to say more, to ask why now. Why this sudden honesty, but the words caught in her throat. She looked down at her sketchpad, pretending to adjust the pencil, though she could barely focus on it. The moment was fragile, suspended in silence until a loud thump from the hallway shattered it. Tim, her younger half-brother, had returned from soccer practice earlier than expected. He called out, laughing loudly about something his friends had said on the field. Both Clara and Richard jumped slightly. I should go," Richard said quickly, his voice regaining its usual calm formality. "I'll leave you to your painting." He gave her a small, awkward smile, then turned and walked toward the door. Clara watched him leave, feeling the air shift around her. Something had changed. The room no longer felt empty or just hers. It felt charged with unspoken words and possibilities. For the rest of the afternoon, she couldn't return to her sketching. Her mind kept replaying Richard's words. He had called her important. He had tried to reach out. She realized she had been so focused on her grief and her solitude that she had not noticed his quiet attempts to stay close. to be part of her life in a meaningful way. That evening, Clara stayed up later than usual. She kept thinking about that moment, the vulnerability, the honesty, and the unexpected warmth it brought. She remembered small things from the past. Richard reading bedtime stories when she was younger, helping with school projects, his quiet presence at family gatherings. She had dismissed these as ordinary duties, but now she saw them differently. They were gestures of care, a form of love that had gone unnoticed. The next morning, Clara found Richard in the kitchen, quietly reading the newspaper. For the first time, he smiled at her without being prompted. "Morning," he said simply. She noticed how natural it felt to return the greeting. "Morning," she replied. He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. The shared moment from the day before lingered between them. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried weight. For Clara, it meant that boundaries could exist alongside connection, that trust could grow quietly over time, and that emotional intimacy didn't always need words. Over the following days, Clara found herself noticing small gestures from Richard that she hadn't paid attention to before. He would leave her favorite tea on the desk when she was working, ask her how her day went without expecting an answer, and occasionally comment on her artwork in ways that felt genuine. Each small gesture chipped away at the distance she had always felt between them. One rainy afternoon, Claire was sorting through old photos of her mother. Richard entered quietly with a box of old family photos. "I found these while cleaning the attic," he said softly. Clara took the box, feeling the weight of memories it contained. There were pictures of her mother smiling brightly, Clara as a toddler with Richard in the background, candid shots of family vacations. She felt a swell of emotion, nostalgia, grief, and an unexpected warmth toward Richard, who had kept these moments safe all these years. "I didn't know you kept these," Clara said softly. I couldn't let go of her completely," Richard admitted. "But I also didn't want to lose you. You're part of what I hold dear." Clara's chest tightened. She realized in that moment that Richard's presence had always been more than a duty. It had been care, patience, and subtle love extending from his relationship with her mother to her own life. The shock she had felt when he first entered her room began to make sense. It wasn't inappropriate, it was awakening. It's a moment of recognition that their bond was real and meaningful. That night, Clara lay awake, thinking about all that had happened. The knock, the words, the shared silence had all shifted something inside her. She understood for the first time that emotional connections were nuanced, layered, and often quiet. It was possible to feel deeply for someone without crossing boundaries or doing anything wrong. And so, the day ended with Clara feeling a mixture of reflection, gratitude, and cautious curiosity. Something had begun, something subtle, yet powerful. The unexpected knock had opened a door not just physically, but emotionally, and she sensed that her relationship with her stepfather was about to evolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The days after that first unexpected visit were different. Clara noticed a subtle shift in her home, as if the air had changed its rhythm. Richard moved through the house with a gentleness she hadn't observed before. He still carried the quiet authority of a stepfather, but there was now an underlying attentiveness, a soft warmth that was hard to ignore. Clara found herself noticing little things. How he poured her tea just right. How he asked about her sketches in a way that wasn't obligatory. How he lingered just a moment longer than necessary when passing by her room. It was strange, and it made her uneasy at first. She had spent years treating him as a background figure in her life, a man who was more a guardian than a companion. But now every gesture felt deliberate and caring, and that realization unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. Clara wasn't sure whether to feel gratitude, curiosity, or something else entirely. She didn't have the words for it. I think perhaps that was why the tension hung in the air like an unspoken question waiting to be answered. One afternoon, Clara was sitting at the dining table, sketchpad open, pencils scattered around her. Richard appeared quietly, holding a small envelope. "I found this while organizing the study," he said. His voice was casual, but there was a hint of nervousness. He placed the envelope in front of her. Clara looked down and saw photographs of her mother from years ago, pictures she had never seen. Moments frozen in time. Her mother laughing at a picnic, brushing her hair back as sunlight fell across her face, reading a story to Clara when she was a child. Clara's chest tightened. She looked up at Richard, unsure of what to say. His eyes held something she didn't expect. A vulnerability, a longing, and an openness that was rare for him. I kept these because I thought you might want them someday, he said softly. I wanted to remember her, and I wanted you to have them too. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she touched the photographs. She could feel the weight of years, of memories preserved, and of love that had endured silently. Thank you, she whispered. The word felt insufficient, but it was all she could manage. Richard nodded, looking down at the table. I don't always know how to be there for you, he admitted. I've made mistakes and I've kept too much distance. But I want you to know I care. I really do. The confession caught Clara off guard. She had never imagined him saying such things, acknowledging his distance, admitting his feelings. She realized in that moment that Richard was more than the stern, reserved stepfather she had known. He was human, flawed, earnest, and quietly devoted in ways she had overlooked. Over the next few days, the house felt lighter, as though an invisible thread had been woven between them. Clara began to look for his gestures, not in a suspicious or critical way, but with an emerging awareness. When he brought her tea while she painted, when he asked how her sketches were progressing, or when he simply shared a silent glance from across the room. She noticed, and she responded in kind. One evening, the tension between them became almost tangible. Clara was in her room working on a portrait of a woman looking out of a window when Richard entered. He didn't knock this time. He simply stepped inside, quietly observing her work. Clara felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the awareness that he was watching, that he cared, that he was present. You're improving, he said softly, almost in a whisper. You're shading. The light in her eyes, it's remarkable. Clara felt a warmth spread across her chest. She looked up at him and realized she had been craving acknowledgement, not flattery, but understanding. Richard's attention wasn't demanding or critical. It was genuine. She didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. She felt seen, and the sensation was both comforting and unnerving. He stayed a moment longer, standing by the doorway before speaking again. I want to be closer to you, Clara. Not in a way that oversteps boundaries, but in a way that matters. You're important to me, more than I probably said before. Clara's mind raced. She had never thought of Richard in this way, as someone who could express emotions so openly. She felt a mixture of gratitude, empathy, and a gentle curiosity about what this shift in their relationship could mean. She didn't respond immediately, unsure of what words could capture the complexity of her feelings. Instead, she turned back to her sketchpad, letting the pencil move again, as if it could translate the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Richard watched quietly for a while, then turned and left without another word. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with the possibility of understanding, of trust slowly growing, of emotional intimacy without complication. The next day, Clara found herself thinking about the small, unnoticed ways Richard had supported her over the years. She remembered the quiet nights when her mother had been ill, and Richard had sat with her in the living room while she sketched in peace. She remembered the times he had quietly fixed her broken chair or helped her carry art supplies upstairs. These gestures, once overlooked, now carried a profound weight. They spoke of a care that had been there all along, subtle but steadfast. One afternoon, Clara was sorting through some old letters from her mother when Richard appeared with a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing it beside her. There was no hesitation in his movements, no expectation, only a quiet attentiveness. Clara looked at him and smiled softly. She realized that these moments, small as they were becoming the foundation of a new understanding between them. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Richard would offer her guidance with a gentle hand, without ever demanding attention or forcing intimacy. Clara found herself responding naturally, sharing small details of her day, speaking about her art, and even laughing quietly at his understated humor. Their interactions were becoming richer, deeper, and more meaningful. Without any awkwardness or tension, one evening, while the rain tapped gently against her window, Clara found herself in conversation with Richard about her mother. They shared memories, stories, and reflections. Richard's voice was soft but steady, filled with both sorrow and warmth. Clara realized she had never truly known him in this way, not as a man, but as a person shaped by love, loss, and experience. "I sometimes feel like I failed her," Richard admitted, his gaze fixed on a photo on the wall. "I loved her and I wanted to protect her, but I couldn't always do enough. And I've been afraid of failing you too." Clara's heart ached at his words. She reached out, placing a hand briefly on his arm. "You haven't failed me," she said softly. "You've always been here, even when I didn't notice." The words created a subtle shift. Richard exhaled slowly, and for the first time, Clara saw a relief in his posture. It was as if years of restraint and distance had finally found a small release. The bond between them, once unspoken and undefined, was beginning to solidify into something real and supportive. Later that night, Clara lay awake, reflecting on the days that had passed. She thought about the first knock, the sudden entrance, the confession of care, and the quiet moments that had followed. She realized that emotional intimacy could grow quietly, almost imperceptibly, and that it didn't need dramatic gestures or overt declarations. What mattered was presence, consistency, and genuine understanding. By the end of the week, Clara noticed that her perception of Richard had changed completely. He was no longer just a stepfather, a distant figure in the background of her life. He was someone who had shared in her grief, who had quietly supported her, and who now sought connection with patience and respect. She felt a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and a tentative affection, not romantic, but deeply human. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, she realized that the relationship they were building would continue to evolve. There was trust, understanding, and emotional depth growing between them. The shock of that first entrance had blossomed into the quiet beginnings of a bond that was strong, meaningful, and safe, a bond that neither Clara nor Richard had anticipated. Yet both would come to value deeply. By the time spring arrived, the house felt lighter, filled with an unspoken rhythm that Clara had never noticed before. The tension that had once existed between her and Richard had softened into something gentle but profound. It wasn't just about being in the same room or sharing meals. It was about a shared understanding, a quiet bond that neither of them had expected, but both had come to rely on. Clara found herself noticing details she hadn't before. The way Richard would leave the window slightly open for her when it was hot, how he adjusted the lighting in her room so her sketches looked their best, how he would pause to ask if she needed anything without pressuring her to respond. These small gestures, once overlooked or dismissed, now carried meaning, like threads slowly weaving their lives together in trust and care. One evening, as rain fell softly outside, Clara sat in her room sketching by the window. Richard knocked lightly before entering, carrying a cup of hot chocolate. "You've been working too hard again," he said. Setting the cup down beside her, Clara glanced up and smiled. "I enjoy it," she replied, her tone light, but inside she felt a quiet appreciation for the effort he had made. The gesture was simple, but it carried more weight than she could express. "I know, but I don't want you to feel alone," he said, settling in a chair near her desk. "Life is too short to carry everything by yourself." Clara looked at him, her chest tightening. She realized that what she had felt the first time he entered her room, the surprise, the sudden shift in emotion, wasn't a fleeting moment. It had been the beginning of a transformation. They had moved from distance to connection, from awkward politeness to quiet intimacy built on understanding and mutual respect. "Thank you," she said softly, not just for the hot chocolate, but for everything, the patience, the care, the acknowledgement that she mattered. Richard nodded, smiling faintly. "You're welcome. I want you to feel safe here, with me, with the house, with everything that's left of your mother's world." That statement hung in the air, and Clara felt an unexpected surge of emotion. It wasn't grief, not exactly it, was recognition, acceptance, and a gentle warmth that came from being truly seen. Her mother's absence was still heavy, but now she realized that her family, Richard, Tim, and even herself could carry that absence with care rather than fear. The following days were filled with quiet routines. But each day brought small discoveries. Clara shared her sketches with Richard, explaining the thoughts behind each one. He listened without judgment, offering comments that were supportive and thoughtful. He didn't intrude, didn't demand attention, but his presence was steady, like a comforting anchor. Clara began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs in the living room, Clara came across a picture of her mother and Richard on their wedding day. The memory struck her not with pain, but with clarity. She realized that Richard's love for her mother had always been sincere, and in some way it extended to her. She looked at him as he walked into the room, carrying a small stack of books for her, and she saw the same care in his eyes that she remembered from the past. "I used to think I had to protect you in silence," Richard said softly, noticing her gaze. "I didn't want to overstep, didn't want to intrude, but now I see. I can be here without taking over. I can care without smothering." Clara felt a lump in her throat. "I've noticed," she replied, "and I appreciate it more than I can say." From that day on, their bond deepened naturally. They began to share stories, not just of the past, but of hopes and small dreams. Richard spoke about his work, his childhood, the ways he had tried to navigate life's challenges. Clara shared her aspirations as an artist, her small fears, and the little victories that made her proud. They laughed together, sometimes quietly, sometimes with bursts of joy that felt both foreign and comforting in the same breath. One evening, Richard brought up a memory from years ago, a time when Clara's mother had been ill and Clara had been too young to understand fully. "I remember sitting here with her," he said, pointing to the living room couch. "You were drawing quietly and she looked at me and smiled. She trusted me with you in ways I didn't realize until much later." Clara looked at him, absorbing the depth of his words. "I guess I didn't realize either," she said. "I've always known you were there, but now I understand it differently." "Yes," Richard said, his voice soft. "We both have grown, and I think we're finding our place in this new life together." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the realization of how far they had come. The shock, the awkwardness, the unexpected first encounter had all led to this quiet, meaningful connection. She felt a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. The following weeks brought more shared moments that were small, yet significant. Clara and Richard cooked together, worked on household projects, and spent evenings sharing music and old stories. The house, once filled with silence and distance, now resonated with laughter, conversation, and an underlying sense of security. One day, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey they had shared. She remembered the first knock, the soft voice at the door, the hesitant words that had opened a new path. She realized that the relationship had evolved naturally, without force, without discomfort, and without overstepping boundaries. It was built on mutual respect, understanding, and the acknowledgement of shared grief and love. Richard, too, had changed. The quiet man who had once avoided deep conversations had become a steady presence. Someone who could express care without embarrassment and who could listen without judgment. He had allowed himself to connect in ways that were meaningful, without rushing or demanding, and that had made all the difference. One evening, Clara and Richard sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The colors of the sky reflected in their eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. Words weren't needed. Their connection was evident in the calm comfort of being near each other, in the quiet acknowledgement of mutual care. "I'm glad we found this," Clara said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect any of this." Richard nodded, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Neither did I, but I think this, us, it's better than I could have imagined." It was a sentiment that encapsulated everything they had shared: the shock, the surprise, the gradual understanding, and the gentle growth of trust and care. Clara realized that relationships could take unexpected forms, and that love, whether for a parent, a stepchild, Or a family member could be tender, steady, and transformative. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The connection with Richard wasn't dramatic or romantic, it was something far subtler, far deeper. It was emotional intimacy, trust, and companionship that filled the space left by grief and brought warmth to their lives. The story that began with a single knock, a moment of shock and hesitant words, had evolved into a lasting bond. Clara and Richard had navigated their grief, their fears, and their uncertainties to discover a quiet understanding that strengthened them both. And though nothing about their lives was perfect, the shift in their relationship had created a foundation of love and support that would endure. Clara felt safe, valued, and seen. Richard felt a sense of fulfillment in being present, in being understood, and in forming a meaningful connection with someone he deeply cared for. That night, as Clara lay in her bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. The first knock, the photographs, the shared stories, the quiet afternoons, they had all led to this sense of closure, growth, and hope. She realized that true bonds often grew in silence, through shared understanding and gentle care, and that the unexpected could sometimes lead to the most meaningful transformations. And with that realization, Clara drifted into sleep, comforted by the knowledge that their relationship, built on trust, empathy, and emotional intimacy, would continue to grow strong, safe, and enduring.